guest tonight is James Perloff. James is the author of Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Unmasking the Forces Behind Global Destruction, and Shadows of Power, an expose on the Council of Foreign Relations. James was also the screenwriter for Shadow Ring, the latest documentary done by Free Mind Films. Correct?
That is correct, and that is actually comes out of the first 6 chapters of Truth is a Lonely Warrior. It's an intro to the New World Order in video format.
Okay. And tonight, of course, we're going to talk about the Council on Foreign Relations, its origins, and the important role it played in the 20th century, and perhaps its key role in building what, for lack of a better word, or their term is the New World Order. The Council on Foreign Relations. So, what is that all about?
Well, the Council is an organization that is, since its inception, devoted to steering American foreign policy towards acceptance of world government. And it's also been the almost monolithic recruiting ground for the American government for cabinet level positions, which is the reason why we only see cosmetic changes when we go from a Democrat to a Republican. So in the White House, I should probably talk a little about the Council's origins. The Council was founded in 1921, and it came into being as a direct result of what had occurred at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. That conference was settling the aftermath of the First World War, and Woodrow Wilson came to that conference with his famous 14 points in hand, and point 14 was a League of Nations. Now, this was a long-term goal of the Illuminati and the cabal of bankers that runs our world, the Zionist bankers, was to have a single government ruling the world. And that's even something that the Bible prophesies. But the League of Nations was the first formal attempt at that, and it was successfully implemented. However, due to the fact that there's a stipulation in the United States Constitution that the president cannot single-handedly make a treaty, it has to be ratified by the Senate. America did not join the League of Nations. The Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty that said, our boys have paid enough sacrificing their lives on the European front for $30 a month, and we don't think that we have to see any reason why America over here should give up its national sovereignty to some international body. So the League of Nations was rejected, and as a result of that, the bankers who had accompanied Wilson to Paris and dictated everything he did there held a series of meetings, and finally at a dinner at the Majestic Hotel on May the 30th, 1919, they resolved to form a new organization that would change America's mind about world government. And that was incorporated 2 years later as the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's, just to give you a taste of it, it has a journal that's it started in 1922. It's still in print, called Foreign Affairs. And the very first issue in 1922 had an article called The Next American Contribution to Civilization. And what's that? I'll quote the article. Quote, "Our government should enter heartily into the existing League of Nations, take a sympathetic share in every discussion broached in the League, and be ready to take more than its share in all the responsibilities which unanimous action of the nations constituting the League might impose," unquote. And you can go from there. I'll just give you one more. From the second issue of Foreign Affairs in 1922, we have Philip Carr declaring, quote, "Obviously there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind as long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government," unquote. So that's their starting point. It is still their goal today. And as we'll see in the course of tonight, they decided that you can't impose world government from the top down. You've got to do it piece by piece, which is why we have things like the EU and NAFTA. But that was how they came into being. And they are, the most influential organization that there is in America as far as formulating foreign policy goes.
Now, the Council of Foreign Relations, it was created 1921, 1922?
21.
Officially. Now, this also coincided with the creation of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the United Kingdom, which developed out of the Rhodes Circle, right?
That's correct. And this was brought to light by Carroll Quigley in his book, Tragedy and Hope. And Rhodes was, Cecil Rhodes was, of course, a diamond and mining magnate, and pretty amazing to have a country named after you, Rhodesia, right? Um, but when he died, he was not married and he didn't have any heirs, and he actually left a large part of his fortune to the Rothschilds, as if they needed it, right? Um, and
Which you
his
guess may suspect what his role was in that. Yeah, like,
Well, they'd been working together, of
yeah.
course, and he had this vision that he always talked about of uniting the English-speaking world. And Tim, as I've looked back on that, I think that that was simply a regional step towards world government. Unite the English-speaking countries first,
Hmm.
and eventually we'll bring in the non-English-speaking countries later. But his inheritance, his will not only created the Rhodes Scholarships, but they created this trust that Lord Alfred Milner, high-ranking Freemason, and Lord Rothschild were in charge of dispersing, and they created what they called the round table groups. And just to quote Quigley, he said, quote, the round table groups were semi-secret discussion and lobbying groups organized by Lionel Curtis, Philip Carr, who I just quoted, and William Morris in 1908 to 11. This was done on behalf of Lord Milner, the dominant trustee of the Rhodes Trust in the decades 1905 to 1925. The original purpose of these groups was to seek to federate the English-speaking world along lines laid down by Cecil Rhodes. And then this to tie in the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute. I'm just moving a little further ahead in his book. He says, quote, at the end of the War of 1914, it became clear that the organization of this system had to be greatly extended. The front organization, called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, had as its nucleus in each area, meaning each part of the English-speaking world, the existing submerged round table group in New York. It was known as the Council on Foreign Relations. It was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company in association with a very small American Round Table Group. And he does mention some of the members of this American Round Table Group, people like the journalist Walter Lippmann and Thomas Lamont, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. And as he also said there, it was a front company for J.P. Morgan and Company. Well, if you take a look at the original leadership of the Council on Foreign Relations back in 1922, the founding president was John W. Davis, who was J.P. Morgan's personal attorney, and the founding vice president was Paul Cravath, who was also a Morgan attorney, and the founding chairman was Russell Leffingwell, who was a partner in J.P. Morgan and Company. So it's definitely a Morgan operation, but just kind of interesting. I was just looking at, before tonight's show, I was looking through their current annual report, and if you look at the current co-chairs, you have Carla Hills, who's on the board of J.P. Morgan Chase. And of course, J.P. Morgan eventually combined with Chase Manhattan, which was the Rockefeller Bank. And of course, David Rockefeller, who's still the honorary chairman of the council, was the official chairman from 70 to 85. And his predecessor was John J. McCloy, who was chairman of Chase Manhattan. But you see this connectivity between J.P. Morgan in 1921 and J.P. Morgan today. It's still the bankers running the show there.
Hmm. Yeah, I find this interesting description of the CFR in an article titled, this is in the mid-90s, The Council on Foreign Relations, the New World Order. And this dates the December of 1995. And he said, the CFR is the promotional arm of the ruling elite in the United States of America. Most influential politicians, academics, and media personalities are members, and it uses its influence to infiltrate the New World Order into American life. Its experts write scholarly pieces to be used in decision-making. The academic expound on the wisdom of a united world, and the media members disseminate the message. Mm-hmm. And that's how it works. And it appears to be sort of a heterodox opinion, but it really is. It's coming. These ideas are produced, and then they're kind of spread out throughout the media, through academia, and it gives the impression of sort of a again like a diverse opinion, but it really is coming from one source.
You're absolutely right, and it obviously was very important to influence public opinion both through the colleges and universities and through the mainstream, mass media. And Quigley, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he commented on the fact that it was obviously looked very strange to have a foreign affairs association that just consisted of bankers and lawyers working for the Rockefellers and Morgans. So they quickly brought in college professors, but
Mm-hmm.
as Quigley pointed out, these all came from colleges and universities that were getting big endowments from J.P. Morgan. So they were people they could count on to come to the council and be indoctrinated in world government and then return to their universities and spread these ideas, just as you were saying. And as a matter of fact, to quote from the 2015 annual report, um, it says, it's describing the different initiatives. It says, quote, the academic outreach connects students with CFR research and programming and provides professors with teaching tools to facilitate a deeper understanding of international issues in their classrooms, unquote. So
Yeah.
that's still going on today. And in terms of the media, um, one reason why we have this false consensus, appearance of consensus in the mainstream media, and why nobody ever questions the war on terror or questions the official narrative of 9/11. Of course, you know that there's 6 corporations that own over 90% of our media. But I talked in one of the chapters of my book, The Shadows of Power, which is actually published in 1988. It's been almost 30 years. I had a chapter on the media contacts back then. But just to look at some of the nexus with the CFR and the media, if you look today at Fox, Murdoch is CFR, and the chairman and CEO of Fox News is Roger Ailes, who's CFR. And if you go to a Time Warner, where you've got CNN, you've got Jeffrey Bewkes is the president of Time Warner. He's CFR. And look at their news anchors that they've had, like Judy Woodruff and Paul Luzon and Aaron Burnett, Peter Bergen, all CFR. And if you move over to Time Magazine, which is now in part of Time Warner, Henry Luce, the founder, was CFR, and Hedley Donovan, who was the longtime editor, was CFR. And I don't want to bore people with a lot of names, but just go to CBS, the founder, William Paley, was CFR, and major anchors like Dan Rather. And you go to NBC, its founder, Robert Sarnoff, was CFR, and Tom Brokaw, and today Brian Williams are CFR. And they go to the New York Times, the Sulzbergers, who owned it, were CFR, and Leslie Gelb actually is the president emeritus today. And same thing with ABC, Washington Post, Eugene Meyer, who took it over in 1933 with CFR, and McNeil Lehrer of PBS, CFR. So, you've got their hooks all over the media. And so since they are indoctrinated in the council's viewpoint, of course, they're going to spread it. And the public is going to get this fake impression that there's a consensus when actually that consensus is emanating from one source.
And what they do is they'll produce policy papers or disseminate memes or ideas throughout the media that appear to be representing the broad interest of, say, the United States. Call it national security or economic policy, but it really represents the narrow interest of a few corporations.
That is correct. That is correct.
Like what's good for GM is good for America, the old, as Charles Wilson said back in the 50s, and that's the attitude, this corporatist mentality. But that's, again, what we're looking at is, what we see here is the actual method by which the ruling elite maintain their dominance. I think it was Carol Quigley who wrote about this dominance. He said about investment bankers, and said nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in the private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. Now, of course, we can see how it's done through the CFR, through the Royal Institute of International Affairs, through the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, or the Australian Institute of International Affairs, or whatever, because they have these different branches throughout the world. They kind of, and they all meet. Of course, we have examples. We have Davos, the World Economic Forum, where the power elite rub elbows. Of course, there's Bilderberg, which for decades we were told was didn't exist, or just something that was dreamt up in the minds of crazy conspiracy theorists. Now it's widely covered and admitted, and other things. Well, we have the Bohemian Grove meeting, the annual soiree that occurs every year out in California, where the power elite get together and have fun, and our concerns about what's going on there are supposed to be allayed by the message that reads entry into the meeting. Weaving spiders come not here. I guess that's supposed to suggest that nothing of anything of importance is ever done there. No important decisions are ever taken there. But that's, I think, a bit naive. I mean, I was reading an article about Bohemian Grove, and the focus of the article was that it's just a party. Nothing important ever happens there. But the photograph that accompanied the article, I guess, was from the late '60s, perhaps around 1967, '68, and the photograph had Richard Nixon sitting at a table with Ronald Reagan, the then governor of California, getting together all these business elite. And again, it's hard to believe that policy decisions aren't being taken there in such a gathering. You have two future presidents of the United States meeting with the business elite. If you want to believe that it's not important, fine. You can go ahead and believe that. But I'm skeptical of such a claim.
That's right. There's ways to have fun besides draping yourselves in these hoods before a 40-foot owl and conducting a mock human sacrifice, and ways to have fun that don't require congregating together as this body. So I would have to say that yes, there's definitely significant discussions, even though we don't get to know what they are,
Yeah.
that are taking place about who's going to be taking over the Fed and who's going to be the next president and vice president and things of that nature. I'm sure are on their lips. And when you have people who are with that kind of power being wielded, I'm sure that they're not just there to play games of darts and stuff.
Yeah. But again, you talk about media, the control of the media, which is key to this. Of course, we're talking about the CFR's control of the media and how all the major networks and publication firms belong to it, or at least their editors, the people of importance of those organizations, belong to the Council on Foreign Relations. But the press itself has always been controlled by powers that be in this country. I mean, even the Pulitzer Prize is named after Joseph Pulitzer, who was a leader of what was called yellow journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the prizes,
very appropriate.
Mm-hmm. The prizes that our journalists, members of the Fourth Estate, covet is a prize named after a ardent or a out of the closet yellow journalist, right? I mean, so we won't be too surprised that news media is going to be biased or manipulated in some way to serve a larger political end or a geopolitical end there.
Yeah, it is interesting that he named it after Pulitzer because he was a propagandist. He was a big propagandist for the Spanish-American War, which my last show with Corbett was on. We talked more about William Randolph Hearst, but I think that the reason they probably didn't call it the Hearst Prize, I don't really know the history of it, but Hearst eventually kind of turned on him a little bit. He actually went against going into World War I, and I think that's he fell a little out of favor, and that's probably why they were able to make the Orson Welles depiction of him that was unflattering.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is usually they won't do their own unless you've done something that irritates them. So I guess they gave it the Pulitzer Prize to number 2 in the propaganda yellow journalism, which was Joseph Pulitzer in his New York World.
Mm-hmm. And of course, with the media, we had Frank Wisner as a mighty Wurlitzer. He said he could play America like an organ, which used the media, and he was good friends with Philip Graham of the Washington Post. And it's come out now that the Ben Bradley, the crusading editor-in-chief of the Washington Post during the Watergate era, was tied to the agency when he worked in Europe, posting propaganda pieces and getting intel. And what's strange enough about that is, one thing you mentioned, William Perloff, because he was CBS and he came from the OSS, and Sarnoff had been either OSS or OWI during the war. So a lot of the people went into media in the dawn of modern media after World War II, emerged from the psychological warfare offices of the United States government during World War II. So it's not too surprising that our media would be, the sources of our information, whether it's print or electronic, would be manipulated by greater powers, because that's what it's founded on. Of course, we have Operation Mockingbird, right? Which
Oh yes, that was brought up by the church committee,
Yeah.
and you're quite right too about the Office of War Information. They would have honed their propaganda skills and honed them very well. You know, the stereotypical films about the Japanese, our enemy,
Hmm.
and so forth, and those could now be. They've been you know making up atrocity stories for years now.
Hmm.
That goes back to the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst when he claimed that in Spain, I mean, I'm sorry, in Cuba, that the Spanish were roasting Cuban priests and were throwing the Cubans to sharks. And of course, that was all made up,
Hmm.
like the baby incubator stories that got us into the
Hmm.
Gulf War, but they wanted to get us into the Spanish American War for multiple reasons, but probably very close to the top of the list was to get control of the Cuban sugar industry. As
Hmm.
Mark Twain later said, it was all about the price of sugar. But atrocity stories, manipulation of public opinion, that is what the media is really about, is control.
And even before, I mean, going back even further, we're going back before World War One. Of course, we mentioned Pulitzer and Hearst and all that, but the Wall Street interest. In 1914, there was a speech on the Senate floor by Senator Callaway that talked about how J.P. Morgan interest
Yes.
had bought up 25 of America's leading newspapers to promote America's entry into the war, which was raging at that time, the First World War, the Great War. And this is another example how these interests would buy up these newspapers, these corporate interests. And of course, that's what we have today, right? I mean,
Well, I could actually quote Callaway right now.
mhm.
Here's what he said. It's actually 1917. This is straight out of the congressional record. Here's what he said, quote, in March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interest, the steel shipbuilding and powder interest, that would be DuPont, and their subsidiaries got together 12 men high in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. They worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and then began by an elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of the 25 greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase a policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature considered vital to the interest of the purchasers. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served, unquote. And so that's 1917, and this is a hot topic in for some congressmen because they were trying to keep us out of the war in 1917. That was when we declared war, and I'm sure that Callaway was on that minority, in that minority that were against it, um, along with people like Bob La Follette, who exposed the whole Lusitania affair and was threatened with impeachment until Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, who'd resigned over the pro-war policy, came forward and confirm what he said about the Lusitania. But you can move it ahead to 1937. Ferdinand Lundberg wrote a magnificent book called America's 60 Families. And I went for a long time without reading that, and I was so glad that I finally got caught up with it. You know, it's out of print. I had to get an old library copy, but he's got a full chapter on there, Tim, on media control, which in 1930s mostly consisted of the newspapers. There's no internet and no TV. But he went from coast to coast, and he showed that virtually every major newspaper or newspaper chain was owned by America 60 or somebody was fronting for them. And there are very few exceptions. I think he said that the Howard Scripps chain was one chain that they hadn't got their hands on yet, but they basically had America's media locked up in 1937. Of course, that was another ideal time to be owning all the media because they were about to get us into another war.
Hmm. And that's why they got it was his father Coughlin got kicked off the radio too at the
I
time.
I haven't heard the story of how he got kicked
Yeah.
off radio, but I sure enjoy listening to or reading the transcripts of some of the. You know, he was like Benjamin Friedman. He was one of those few guys out there that you could actually turn to and hear what was really going on in America because he wasn't owned.
Yeah. And back then, America still had some diversity. They had that sort of that Midwestern
Hmm.
conservative opposition to the Eastern Seaboard, and then, of
Right.
course that was illustrated or manifested best in the American First Committee, which became slandered, as being
Yeah.
pro-Nazi because they weren't active supporters of America's entry into the war. Of course, they did after Pearl Harbor. They fell into line like everyone else, which is one of the reasons why that operation was pulled off, to get everyone marching off to war. Yeah, yeah. You also back then you also had regional business interests that supported. They reflected the values of their region, whether it was the Michigan or Midwest, and they were very opposed to FDR's drive to war, and they formed the financial support for the American First Committee. I think the owners of the Sears Roebuck Company, or General Wood, and these guys were big funders for the American First Committee. Of course, now that would be impossible because now we live in such a globalized economy that there's no such thing as a localized business that has a loyalty to a region or a region of the country. That wasn't wasn't so much the case in the 1930s. We still had these regional businesses.
You're right. Part of the consolidation process is political. So you know the EU is an example of political consolidation. The common market and NAFTA are examples of economic consolidation, but they also have, of course, these business mergers, and you have your corporations moving in, your Walmarts, and
you mentioned that in Truth is a Lonely Warrior.
Yeah,
I think it's chapter 10.
Well, I forget which chapter it's in, but the fact that the mom and pop businesses and the smaller local businesses are either put out of business by the big corporate interests or they get bought out. There's even been concern within the organic food industry that more and more suppliers of organic foods are being bought out by the big multinationals because they can come forward with millions of dollars and offer more than the company's worth, and few people will resist that on grounds of principle alone. Many people will give in, and then of course they've got their hands on the food industry. So there's a consolidation process, even extends into religion, which is what ecumenicism is, one world religion. But you're right, they took that out. But just to get back to America First for a moment, there's a famous quote from Admiral Chester Ward, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. They made a mistake when they let him in. He was former Judge Advocate of the U.S. Navy. He resigned in disgust, but here's what he said. He said that the Council objective is, quote, submergence of U.S. sovereignty into an all-powerful one-world government. This lust to surrender the sovereignty and independence of the United States is pervasive throughout most of the membership. In the entire CFR lexicon, there is no term of revulsion carrying a meaning so deep as America First, unquote. Admiral Ward, and of course Admiral Ward is referring to to the America First Committee of Charles Lindbergh and General Wood, and that is something that really ticked off these New World Order guys. They did not want nationalism. They degraded that as isolationism, and isolationists, to use their term, were not against international communications, but they simply wanted us to retain our sovereignty and to follow the principles of America's founding fathers and not become entangled in foreign wars.
Yes, because you lose control of your own nation when that happens. Of course, we see that today with the various interests, the very strong, is Israeli or Jewish lobby is related to Israel.
It's worse than ever. Yeah,
and of course in the 30s, you had that too, but biggest thing you had. British influence. The British. Everyone talks about German Nazi or German fifth columnist. No one talks about British fifth columnist. Working in this because they were in league with the White House and the Eastern Seaboard, the Anglophile Eastern Seaboard interest and all that. So, but you had that going on, and you had to the American First Committee just simply wanted to maintain America's sovereignty and steer clear of these European wars. But if a good example is what influence the war party had back then was they had everything they had pretty much all the communications and the media at their disposal, because even Hollywood was in league.
Correct.
If you look at movies like Gunga Din coming out in 1941, Sergeant York, 1941. That's no coincidence. You also had movies like Casablanca, where Rick is supposedly the isolationist, right? The American expat who doesn't want to get involved in the fight, but inevitably he realizes, well, nope, he can't not stay out of the conflict, and he begins this beautiful relationship with the French, with the with the chief of police there at the end. This is the beginning of a beautiful relationship, and the movie ends.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a
Well,
movie against like, so-called isolationism.
they hired the best, and actually, one of the screenwriters for that also wrote the screenplay for Mission to Moscow, which came out during the war, which is really, I think, the most pro-communist movie perhaps that Hollywood ever
Oh
produced.
yeah, it's Joseph
Uh,
Davies' book or something.
um, Joseph Davies, based on his book.
Yeah. It
Um,
turns out he was bribed, wasn't? Didn't he get receive a bunch of money from like jewels and paintings from the Bolsheviks?
well, I know he did very, very well for
Yeah.
himself. And he was a also very high-ranking Freemason, as was Roosevelt, and so it was a big push on to support the war effort. And it's interesting you're mentioning Sergeant York. I don't know if we touched on this before. It was released in September of '41. I think it was just a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, and this movie was about a Sergeant York, who'd been reluctant. It was a
Yes.
true story, basically, but he was a guy who was, for religious reasons, was reluctant to enlist in World War One,
Gary
and he
Cooper.
did enlist, became a hero, and now the message was, look, if it'll be like Sergeant York, we just got bombed. Hey, you got to enlist, go and fight in Europe, just like Sergeant York did.
Yeah.
And I believe Gary Cooper won the Oscar as Best Actor for that. They're pretty good at handing out Oscars for, Gentleman's Agreement, getting the Oscar in March of 1948, and then Harry Truman recognized in Israel in May of 1948. Of course,
Yeah.
Gentleman's
Yeah.
Agreement
Yeah.
being about the the problem of anti-Semitism in America, and of course, we all know about the movie Pearl Harbor coming out strategically in between PNAC calling for a new Pearl Harbor and the actual 9/11 event. The movie came out in May of 2001 to prepare America. Even though Touchstone's Pictures, to my knowledge, had never produced a war movie or a patriotic movie prior to that.
Mhm.
So Hollywood is definitely, and I know you've done shows did one recently on Hollywood psyops, but Hollywood definitely throughout the years has timed its movies for strategic impact on American opinion.
Yeah, I was listening to a talk about that. He said there was a movie that involved, I forget what the name of the movie was, but this is because the illustration how it's done is because a lot of these movies they request help from the Pentagon for use of equipment,
Right.
scenery, advice, and in return for that, the Pentagon gets to rewrite the scripts. So they have the liaison office. So basically, they'll turn a movie into a propaganda thing for the Pentagon or U.S. foreign policy or something. And they've done studies like Tom Secker, who's done research in Hollywood and CIA and the Pentagon. The Pentagon's been involved in shows like Cake Wars. So it's a big psyop thing, and it's hard to know what their objective is. But I do think a lot of these shows are some sort of cultural programming, and so
Definitely.
although it may not be overt, but they're involved in these shows that have nothing to do that have nothing to do with the military, but they're involved in the production of these shows. But this one show involved a terrorist attack, and the script didn't involve it didn't really it was supposed to be a domestic terrorist attack, but the Pentagon said, "We'll help you," but switched it to make the terrorists from this country, and it was a country that the U.S. was ready would bomb in the next 6 to 12 months. You know,
Oh, we're always being prepped. In fact,
like
uh,
what? Why?
I,
Why is it the crazy Libyans in Back to the Future? Remember that?
yeah, actually, as uh, the war on terror unfolded, beginning with Reagan bombing Libya in 1986, you suddenly had all these movie psyops. Yeah, it was the Libyans in Back to the
Mm-hmm.
Future, and there was another movie, Not Without My Daughter, about a woman trying to get her daughter out of crazy Iran. And there was Delta Force, and all these movies that were suddenly gearing us up for the new enemy. I've got an article on my website, jamesperloff.com. It's called "Did the Cold War End so that the War on Terror could begin?" Because Tim, maybe we've discussed this on your show. I can't remember,
Yeah,
but
no.
I had this when Glasnost occurred. It sent kind of shockwaves to us in the anti-communist movement. I was writing for the New American Magazine, and like, oh, how come the communists? It just didn't seem like they would voluntarily give up their power, and we're trying to evaluate that. But in retrospect, as I look back on it, um, obviously, what should have happened when the Cold War ended what should have happened is that we should have turned our budget to domestic things. There should have been no longer a need for a big military budget. But what happened is Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Reagan bombed Gaddafi in 86 based on a false flag psyop pulled off by the Mossad. And you can read that in the book, The Other Side of Deception by Viktor Ostrovsky, a former Mossad agent, how Mossad planted a Trojan transmitter in Libya to make it look like Libya had bombed this American discotheque. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union broke up, and in 1991, we fought our first land war in the Middle East, the Gulf War of 91. And so you see this progression out of the Cold War into the war on terror, but Hollywood very much bringing us along with the new enemy, the Arabs and the Muslims.
That's right, because prior to that, Arabs were kind of treated as being somewhat exotic, and all of a sudden they become demonized as the new enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course you have Lawrence of Arabia, and of course that involves World War One and the intrigues of the British breaking up the Ottoman Empire and getting into the Middle East. But yeah, you have this coordination with the media, and Hollywood just is one more element to it. But if you really at the top, the corporations and the people that run Hollywood are integrated into the Council on Foreign Relations, even various actresses and actors and directors, all CFR guys, and gals. So the connections are all. This is one again. This is another example of how the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a representative or agent of the powers that be, the financial interests, the corporate interests, the ruling elite. That's how they implement their agenda and how they how they influence policy, and they give the appearance again of heterodox opinion, of consensus. But it really it's emanating from a single source to promote the narrow interest of the people that run a handful of corporations. So, but you call it you've called it a factory of U.S. foreign policy. Can you give us examples of that?
Certainly. The United Nations came out of the Council on Foreign Relations. What happened was when World War II began, their executive director, Walter Mallory, went with the editor of Foreign Affairs, Hamilton Fish Armstrong, down to Washington and met with the Assistant Secretary of State, George Messersmith, who was also a member of the CFR, and they reached an agreement that the CFR would start to help, quote unquote, the State Department formulate its wartime policy, and they produced almost 700 papers for the Roosevelt administration and began basically to take over the State Department. And it was a group of CFR members called the Informal Agenda Group that actually generated the plan for the United Nations. And the reason they called themselves Informal Agenda Group was because they had this bad memory of how the Senate had got wind of how bad the League of Nations might turn out to be, and they didn't want the Senate to interfere. And so by choosing the name Informal Agenda Group, nobody's going to look into a group that has a boring name like that. But the UN, of course, became a very significant organization. When it held its founding conference in San Francisco in 1945, 47 of the U.S. delegates were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It was their baby the whole way. And of course, that was successfully implemented. This time, the Senate was given very little time to debate this time around. And you and I have done a show on the Korean War, but the first regrets on joining the UN started to come in with the Korean War because Harry Truman sent troops to Korea. We had over 30,000 dead and 100,000 wounded, and he did not bother getting a declaration of war. He didn't even bother to consult the Congress because he said he was doing this in response to the UN's call for UN action, and it was a police action, and he was obliged under the treaty. So they formulated that. But another example would be the Marshall Plan, which, according to the mainstream media version, is it was thought up by General George Marshall, but students of the CFR have revealed that it was actually formulated at the Council on Foreign Relations by a study group that had David Rockefeller as its secretary. It's amazing how long this guy's been around. We're talking 1947 he was active. Um, and the reason that Marshall was picked to present the Marshall Plan, it was originally going to be called the Truman Plan, but in their discussion, they decided that if Truman introduced it, the Republicans might oppose it and think it was a Democratic boondoggle. And so, since Marshall was misperceived as being politically neutral, he was actually very much under the shadow and wing and control of the powers that be. By having a general introduce it, it could get bipartisan support, and that worked. It got bipartisan support, and the Marshall Plan had a couple of goals. One was to use taxpayer money to subsidize corporations to send these goods to Europe on the pretext that Europe was starving. And the second was to actually, the funds were actually used to jumpstart what would ultimately become the EU. The Europeans actually had to pay for Marshall Plan goods with something called counterpart funds. These were printing press money. And the man in charge of those funds was none other than John J. McCloy. And then in 1947, Jean Monnet, who Time magazine called the father of Europe, sent his delegates to McCloy and said that they needed funds for a program for European unity. So Marshall Plan funds were actually converted into what was called the Council of Europe, and newspapers and college programs to promote European unity. All of this eventually became the common market and ultimately the EU. So without even knowing it, American taxpayer funds supported the creation of the EU. And that's what the Marshall Plan was basically about, profit and political consolidation, but sold to Americans as helping the needy and dreamed up by an American general, but actually a product of the CFR.
Because one thing I realized about this cabal, the claque of people, is they're monopolists.
Mm-hmm.
And they seek, not only do they seek to monopolize their own given industry, they seek a political monopoly too, because that way they can also further extend their control. They're not just their profits, but their control of the world. That's how they get into these countries. The IMF and the World Bank are used to pry open markets of third world countries and let them get access to the resources to those countries on the cheap through the issuances of use of debt as a weapon. And that's again one method that they use to control these countries. You control the countries, you control the local governments, local satrap regimes. You get in there, and you can get them to kick off native people off their ancestral homelands, throw them into the cities. And you get the resources cheap. You can pollute without any problems, and then you also have a source of cheap labor in the cities, which then you can export the factories to these areas when the cost of labor gets too expensive here in the United States. And they call that free trade.
Amazing. You've just summarized it very well. And I should mention that the World Bank and IMF are another example of something that was generated by the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, officially, of course, they were created at the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, but all of the initial groundwork and planning was done before Bretton Woods by the War and Peace Studies Project of the CFR, which I just mentioned. They had a branch within that called the Economic and Finance Group, and they're the ones who dreamed up the World Bank and the IMF, and they were formally instituted at Bretton Woods, but that's another CFR project. So again, they are like a factory of American foreign policy. The irony is, Tim, that Americans didn't even know that the CFR existed. The first major article to appear about it was 1958, an article by Joseph Kraft called School for Statesmen, and I believe that was in Harper's. But there was not on, basically they were operating without any public knowledge. Of course, the main media organs like the New York Times were not going to talk about it. And eventually they'd be mentioned here or there. And now, of course, they've got a website and they're more open. But it is ironic that a group that had almost monolithic control of our foreign policy was not even, their very existence was not known to the American public.
Well, much like the NSA, right, for decades, or CIA for that matter. Of course, they came out kind of in the late '50s. People got a general idea of that movie. People started making movies about it, like North by Northwest and things like that. But yeah, well, now they have a Washington office, as Hillary Clinton was happy to say, because she said, as she said in her speech, she doesn't have to go to New York now to receive her orders, and she said that as Secretary of State.
Right. Well, I'll give the folks the exact quote
Yeah.
from Hillary, and they can see this on YouTube. But she said this. She's speaking at their Washington branch. They started in New York City because that's where the banks are, but eventually they decided if they wanted to control Washington, it'd be nice to have a branch down there. So here's what Hillary said, quote, I have been often to, I guess, the mother's ship in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this means I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future, unquote. Kind of a vivid admission that the council does set policy and tell our officials what to do.
Yeah,
And
and a good
like,
example of how it gets done, business gets done, is uh, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, okayed about $150 billion of arms sales to various terrorist, repressive regimes around the world, and they in
no
turn
kidding.
donated money to the Clinton Foundation.
Yeah, isn't it amazing how that
Yeah,
works? And I guess there's no limit on donations to the foundation, whereas there are limits on overtly political campaign contributions.
certainly. And of course, the World Bank is there, or the IMF is there, to make sure that the money is loaned to these governments to buy these weapons, that the taxpayers, after which the taxpayers ultimately underwrite, because that's how the system is set up with these third world loans. And of course, the taxpayers underwrite the loans ultimately, and the collateral for the loans is the you could say are the resources of said countries. So,
Yeah, they've been doing that for a long time. That's how the game works. And of course, the IMF and the World Bank are backed by the good faith of the American taxpayer. You're mentioning Hillary. My latest post is actually on Hillary, and it's actually just a collection of cartoons, memes, and funny videos about Hillary. Because sometimes I feel that humor is more effective than just writing a serious essay. But I actually feel that the establishment has picked her, at least as their favorite choice as president. And the reason I say that, Timothy, is that she's the only candidate that is viable, that seems to be 100% what the Rothschilds and the powers that be want. I mean, she's pro-gun control, she's pro-Israel, she's pro-war on terror, she's pro-Fed, she's pro-GMO, she's pro-Monsanto, she's pro-mass immigration, she's pro-population control, she's pro-internet censorship. And a couple other clues are she's gotten more money from Wall Street and Goldman Sachs than any other candidate except maybe Jeb Bush, depends on the analyst tallying up the numbers. And also, she was made Secretary of State. It seems like the probable main purpose of that was to give her a credential, or one of the main purposes was to give her a credential to run for the White House with. Also, after she was Secretary of State, CBS came out with a
yes.
show called Madam Secretary, which is promoting her and profiling her in a positive way every week to millions of viewers. And the other reason I think that they're backing Hillary, Tim, is that they already trusted her for 2 terms in the White House behind Bill, and of course Bill will be going right back in the White House if we elect her. So I think their money's on Hillary. I think that they wouldn't mind having a socialist in there, but Bernie Sanders is too anti-banker and Trump is too anti-immigration, and he says he's pro Second Amendment. So I don't think they would allow either one. And so I think that the powers that be have her lined up. But of course, there are problems. But we saw already that they had no trouble sweeping Bill Clinton's scandals under the carpet. So
Yeah.
I think that they may be planning to do the same with Hillary's, with her emailing, etc.
Well, she clearly
And guys,
violated her security agreements and oaths when she had her aides, cut off the classification on those emails, and she put them on her server. It's a clear violation of security, and anyone lower down the rung would have already been indicted, if not convicted, for that. So
well, I remember when Bill Clinton was president. He had, as you know, he had many scandals. There was not only the women, but there was Whitewater, and there was
mhm.
perjury, and there were reports of overseeing drug deals when he was governor of Arkansas, and murder connections, and Travelgate and Chinagate, and every time one of those scandals came up in conservative media, they said this is it. He's going to be impeached. And you know what, Tim? 2 weeks later, it would all be forgotten about, and it would be back to business as usual. So I'm afraid that because we've got that pattern established for the Clintons, that the same thing is going to happen here, that so much power is going to be wielded on her behalf that they're going to just show us they can get anyone elected no matter what.
Yes.
But I'm not sure of that, but that's just how I feel it's trending.
Mm-hmm. Now, yeah, so basically we've demonstrated that all the major policy decisions that were taken all originated out of the CFR, pretty much the post-war era, the institutions, all our CFR ideas. And of course, I think the Department of Homeland Security was a idea that was spawned by a committee that was, I think, populated by members of the CFR, correct? And that was before 9/11, right?
That's correct. In fact, let me just grab that information for you. It was a committee that had 12 members, 9 of whom were in the CFR. And goodness, I'm going to have trouble finding that exact reference. So good my index is here. Wait a minute.
But the interesting point is this was I think the idea was submitted before the events of 9/11.
Okay, here it is. Yeah. It was the United States Commission on National Security proposed a National Homeland Security Agency in 1998, and National Homeland Security Agency is the very phrase President Bush used 3 years later after 9/11. So yeah. That was 9 out of 12 were CFR members on that. Remember, the CFR has less than 5,000 members, and when Kennedy was president, they only had about 900. So yet they've managed to dominate. I should mention the dominance. We haven't mentioned the numbers yet. But to sum up the current tally, 19 secretaries of state have been members of the CFR, 21 secretaries of the Treasury, 23 defense secretaries, which includes the older War Department, and 16 CIA directors. And I'd like to just stop there and mention why they concentrate on particularly dominating these departments. Obviously, they want the Treasury Department because they want to control the flow of money. They want the Defense Department because they want to be able to control the wars. They want the State Department because it's our foreign policy that generates those wars usually. And of course, they want the CIA to control intelligence, both foreign and domestic. So they're particularly focused, but broadly, they dominate cabinet. So if you look at the current cabinet of Obama, Secretary of State John Kerry is a member. Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew is a CFR member, as was his predecessor, Timothy Geithner. Ashton Carter, the current Secretary of Defense, is a member. His predecessor, Chuck Hagel, and his predecessor, Robert Gates, all working for Obama, were all CFR. The Director of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, is CFR, as was his predecessor, Napolitano. Over at Commerce, Penny Pritzker is a member. At Energy, Ernest Moniz is a member, and Joe Biden's a member. And you go back through time, you go back to Bush, Cheney was a member, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz. Bill Clinton had 12 CFR members in his cabinet. So they dominate through time. And this is, again, one of the reasons why you see only minor changes. When, Obama became president, a lot of believing Democrats thought he was going to end the wars in the Middle East. In fact, he had promised during his campaign that his first day in office, he would order the troops home from Afghanistan. And, years and years later, they're still there, right? But one reason why we have so little change is because you're electing the same guys. They just take off the Republican stick pins from their label and put on a Democrat stick pin. But it's the same CFR controlling our policy. President Kennedy once complained about this. He said, "Why don't I ever see any new faces?" when somebody handed him a list of State Department personnel to pick.
Yeah, he eventually got the message, didn't he?
As some would say, yes.
Yeah. I think he was invited to the CFR, but never showed, from what I understand.
Well, interestingly enough, his name never appeared on the roster of the Council on Foreign Relations, but he did write a letter stating that he was a member. and I don't know what the reason for that is. It may have been a mistake, or perhaps he was a silent member that
Mm-hmm.
was not on their rolls. I don't know the reason. He said he was a member, but he never was listed
But
officially.
so we're looking at basically the CFR again. We describe it is a uh, it's been called I would call one of these imperial brain trusts
Hmm.
that do the work of the ruling elite, the corporations, the banksters that run the world, and with the veneer of some sort of disinterested or less independent think tank. Um, but basically, it represents, for lack of a term, Wall Street, the banks, the moneyed interests, so they can go on exploiting the world. And if you look at something like the CIA and how it grew out of this financial elite itself, the I think when it was formed, the committee that was formed to write the draft proposal for the CIA was full of a bunch of Wall Street bankers and bond salesmen. So, people like Robert Lovett, Alan Dulles himself, and his brother John Foster Dulles were both CFR members, and they both worked for the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, which did the bidding for U.S. multinational corporations. And in fact, they're the best example. Those two are the best examples, best you get illustration or embodiment of this corporatist fascist system we live under. You know.
Right. Alan Dulles was, in fact, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and his brother, John Foster Dulles, was a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he actually contributed an article to the very first issue of Foreign Affairs in 1922. He also helped draft the UN Charter. You're talking about a globalist extraordinaire.
Mm-hmm. Because he was at Versailles.
He was at Versailles as,
Yes,
I
yeah,
believe, legal counsel to the
yeah.
American delegation, along with Paul Warburg, the founder of the Fed, was there, and Bernard Baruch, who made over 100 million in profits off World War I. They were all there surrounding Woodrow Wilson.
Mm-hmm. And in the the Dulles brothers themselves, because they went on to dominate U.S. foreign policy in the immediate post-war era. Throughout the 50s. And of course, it was Alan Dulles, who was immediately sacked by JFK after the Bay of Pigs debacle. And of course, he oversees the investigation of JFK's assassination. So there
Yeah,
you
he was
go.
on that team along with John J. McCloy.
So, I mean, what we're looking at here is an oligarchy. And I don't think America's descent into oligarchism or becoming an oligarchy has been a gradual thing. I guess you could say the money interests always existed from the get-go, but they really seem to consolidate their power in the late 19th, early 20th century. This probably had something to do with the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, America as the federal government consolidating its power over the country.
Mm-hmm.
But lately there was a study out of Princeton. Was it Princeton University? It said the United States is an oligarchy. And he says America is no longer a democracy. Never mind the democratic republic envisioned by the founding fathers. Rather, it has taken a turn down elitist lane and become a country led by a small dominant class comprised of powerful members who exert total control over the general population. An oligarchy, said a new study jointly conducted by Princeton and Northwestern universities.
How do you like that? Princeton actually
Yeah.
affirms what the truth movement's been saying for over a decade, long over a decade, depending on your view of what the truth movement is. But more and more of us, ever since 9/11, of course, have been waking up to that fact. But to beat Princeton to the punch, let me give you a quote that I probably gave on this show before. It's one of my favorites. This is from 1937. Quote, the United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy, which dominates the United States, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and a dollar democracy, unquote. That is Ferdinand Lundberg in his 1937 book, America's 60 Families. So Princeton is a little slow on the uptake, I'd say.
Yeah, there was in this report they quote a lady from Death and Taxes magazine, Robin Panaccia. She says this is the Duh report.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so I mean, this is so how I mean we're talking about oligarchy, and I guess oligarchy. If you look at throughout history, that's usually how societies are run, and I don't think that America is any exception, despite claims of American exceptionalism, um, because the moneyed interests have created these institutions and agencies that that pretty much lock up the system for them, rig the system in their favor. Good example with that would be well, this may not be directly tied to the CFR, but it's the Federal Reserve System, and
Or
I know you've
the
written a lot on that, the banking and money, and how control of credit and money is key to keeping this whole thing together. Correct?
That's correct. In fact, let me just get you some more names here. They are CFR connected, and just last year, Obama appointed Janet Yellen, of course, to head the Fed, and Stanley Fischer as vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Also, Lael Brainerd and Jerome Powell to positions as governors on the Federal Reserve Board. All four are members of the CFR. Four for four, 100%. So um, it's definitely a controlled system. And just to tie it together, a lot of linkage between the founders of the CFR and the Federal Reserve. In fact, David Rockefeller, who was, as we mentioned, a long time CFR chairman, still is the honorary chairman of the CFR, is actually the grandson of the legislator who introduced the original Federal Reserve legislation, Nelson Aldrich. Senator Nelson Aldrich, introduced the original central banking legislation. It was rejected because it was too closely associated with the Rockefellers, so it had to be passed under another name, Glass Owen. But David Rockefeller actually is the grandson of the guy who started the Federal Reserve, you could say. So, and of course, his Chase Manhattan Bank merged with the Manhattan Bank, which is owned by the Warburgs. And of course, Paul Warburg was the original vice chairman and the brain behind the Federal Reserve at Jekyll Island when it was secretly created. So it all ties together, the Fed and the CFR.
Yeah, the meeting at Jekyll Island, which no one seemed to know about until maybe 2 decades later, when it was written about by one of its participants, Frank Vanderlip,
Mm-hmm.
who I think he wrote in 1935. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. His word is conspirator. Conspiracy, huh? I do not I did not feel it was any exaggeration to speak out of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of an actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come on at a time as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal of New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on our last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else our time and effort would be wasted. So there you go.
That's
Okay,
right. And
genuine conspiracy.
definitely. And the people at that meeting included Paul Warburg, who was representing the Rothschilds, and you had Aldrich there. You had Benjamin Strong, who was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, Henry Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan and Company, and Charles Norton, who was head of Morgan's First National Bank of New York. So there you've got the Morgan people, and you'll recall our quoting Carol Quigley earlier on the fact that the CFR was a front group for J.P. Morgan and Company. So once again, CFR. Obviously, if you are going to create wars, you are going to need money for it. And isn't it interesting that just 6 months after the Federal Reserve was created, December of 1913, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, starting the First World War, and the Fed helped fund it for us, and we wound up having our national debt grow from 1 billion to 25 billion. Small potatoes compared to today when we're, multiple trillions, but that was a very significant increase at the time. Again, the timing not coincidental.
Mm-hmm. And right, because you had the death of the murder of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, and some of people link that assassination to uh, British Freemasonry, British agents operating in the Balkans.
Well, I was once talking to a guy who himself was had been a big executive, Fortune 500 company, and I was explaining all this to him, and I said I made that very comment to him that just 6 months after the Fed was founded, you had the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. He says, "Well, how do you tie that together with the Fed?" And the answer is, it's well, at least it's been testified that the assassins were Freemasons, sworn to secrecy. They've been involved in so many intrigues, starting with the French Revolution and the
Mm-hmm.
Mazzini revolutions and the Young Turk revolutions. They always had the hand of Freemasonry. They're trusted agents because they're sworn to obedience and sworn to secrecy. How do you tie that to the Fed? Well, they were Grand Orient Freemasons in that assassination, and Paul Warburg, founder of the Fed, was a 33rd degree Grand Orient Freemason. So it's very easy to see how that network on one level could be operating at this executive level to create a central bank in America, while at another level they were dispensing orders through a local branch of a local lodge of masonry to these assassins who are simply described in mainstream books as Serbian nationalists to
Yeah.
take out the Archduke.
Yeah, lone nut, right? Or madman.
Lone nuts in this
Yeah.
case, yeah.
And well, the one thing is British Freemasonry itself, and particularly British Freemasonry, has historians look at it. It's a vehicle for destabilization, for revolution abroad. There's a book called Builders of Empire that's about British Freemasonry, its role in building and maintaining the British Empire. So this is a practical way which people meet in secret and organize to conspire, to undermine, and to destabilize certain parts of the world. This is what empires do, and British. That's just one way that it's done, through the lodges. So I mean, it's
Right, and they also have lodges which are not involved in anything sinister, and those operate as a nice front for those that are operating in a sinister fashion and a conspiratorial fashion. So very tricky when you have a network that is completely secret and legally so. Very hard to decipher it without being on the inside.
and that model is how intelligence agencies operate. So the Freemasonic model is it's a model. It's
Mhm.
a blueprint for revolution or destabilization or subversion. And that can be applied in different circumstances in different ways to achieve an objective. And if you examine British imperial policy or, of course, U.S. foreign policy today, you can see these principles being played out in Syria or even in Europe today. With the destabilization efforts that are going along. So again, it's sub rosa. It isn't obvious, but just you have to analyze the situation, look at the history, and this stuff isn't crazy conspiracy stuff. It's really happened, and people who've looked closely at things like the French Revolution or the First World War uh, will see these identifying markers of the black hand of Freemasonry involved in these events.
In fact, I'll tell you an interesting one. Um, this is maybe not be too well taken by some of your more patriotic listeners, but you're of course familiar with Paul Revere's famous ride.
Mm-hmm.
He was sent on that ride by Dr. Charles Warren, and he also sent another writer, William. Let's see if I can remember his name. Was it William Dawes? And whose history is basically forgotten as I have. And they rode out to Lexington, Mass., which is the town I grew up in, and they met at the house where John Hancock was staying. But what history books never mention is that Dr. Charles Warren was the Grand Master of St. Andrew's Freemasonic Lodge that met at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. And Paul Revere was a member of that lodge. And the second writer, if I'm remembered his name correctly, Dawes, was also a member of that lodge. And John Hancock was a member of that lodge. So everybody on the circuit of Paul Revere's ride was a member of that lodge. And actually, if you go to my website, jamesperloff.com, I've got a pretty unique article there called The Secrets Buried at Lexington Green. I used to walk by Lexington Green where the battle that started the revolution took place. And believe it or not, it was a false flag. But we won't go into that tonight. But it's no coincidence that the North branch of a Scottish Rite Freemasonry in all of America has its headquarters right there in the small town of Lexington, Mass. It's for they had a very big hand in the events that took place on April the 19th, 1775. But that's for another show.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just an example of just how far-reaching Freemasonry has gone in generating revolutions that have changed the world order.
Well, from my understanding, is that what happened was when the Illuminati was exposed, they went underground and they infiltrated the lodges.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the goal of the Illuminati was the destruction of crown and altar. And you could see some of that rhetoric in the people don't like to see this, but that those ideas did inform much of the American War of Independence. Thomas Jefferson and this idea of freedom, equality, and fraternity, or liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is a Freemasonic slogan.
Right.
And so I've heard some people refer to U.S. government, we have a free Masonic republic or democracy now, because it's based on these ideas and the destruction of the idea of leveling everything and destroying the church is in the name of liberty. And it might have some appeal. Of course, in America, we have the separation of church and state, which isn't in the Constitution. It was written in a letter by Thomas Jefferson to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut. But it's been applied as some sort of constitutional doctrine to weaken the influence of the church in the United States. You can see some sort of Freemasonic, strategizing or conspiracy in that.
Absolutely. The Freemasons are historically very antithetical towards religion. I once met a Freemason just in a business circumstance, and we weren't, not as a writer or anything like that. And he was talking about his Freemasonry, and he was talking about how he was boasting of the fact that at a Catholic church, he'd inscribed images of Satan in the eyes of a statue of Mary. And he was laughing and saying,
Wow.
Now those stupid Catholics, when they bow down before Mary, they don't know it, but they're bowing down before Satan. And it's always been kind of built into the upper levels of Freemasonry. It would not be known by a first-degree Mason who's just been introduced. But if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, it was Freemasons like Hugo Black and William Douglas and Earl Warren and Potter Stewart and Thurgood Marshall who have undermined the institution of religious freedom in this country. Mm-hmm. Starting with throwing school prayer out and then demanding that the Ten Commandments be taken down. And these were the founding fathers had really maybe some of them did intend that. I'm sure people like Thomas Paine did, but it was not written in the Constitution. It's through, I believe, they have greater loyalty to their Masonic oath than they do to the oath to uphold the Constitution. That is a big problem with these secret societies.
That's true, because the idea of non-established church is only meant to apply to the federal government, because the federal government is supposed to be very weak and very specific. States had established churches, regardless of what you think of that. It wasn't unconstitutional. It wasn't unconstitutional. States had established churches.
Right, and thank God for those anti-federalists who were suspicious enough and demanded that the Bill of Rights be attached, because that Bill of Rights has been a real barrier mm-hmm. to the imposition of even worse police state than we have right now in America. Those rights have done right by those rights for a long time now, but they are, of course, weakening. And of course, you see Obama trying to override the Second Amendment with executive orders, and we see just a constant chipping away at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, I saw an interesting bumper sticker the other day. I read, "The Bill of Rights is my Patriot Act."
Sure, that's all you need.
That's all you need.
We certainly, as you and I know, we don't need all this Homeland Security, because that as I do, that 9/11 was an inside job mm-hmm. With the help of Israelis, and the wars that we've had, be it the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or the unnecessary war in Gaddafi because he was going to introduce the gold dinar, or the false claims that Assad had used sarin gas on his own people in Syria. All these wars and all these things ISIS was funded and created by the United States, and that was acknowledged by the former director of the Defense intelligence agency. Ron Paul has talked about that on his weekly show.
Hmm.
But mainstream media's and the CFR not batting an eyelash. It's more. We got to have more war on terror, and Hillary and the rest of the candidates are all talking about how they'll carry on the war on terror, and we must stop ISIS. But in fact, we've created these enemies. Since we've created the enemies, we obviously never needed the security measures against them or the gigantic defense budget in the first place.
That's true. I mean, I remember. Well, if you go back to the one of the justifications for the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency was the failure to connect the dots regarding Pearl Harbor. Right? And so then we can't have this occur. We need to get we need someplace to coordinate, to collate and coordinate this intelligence and give the best advice to the President of the United States. That's what it's supposed to be. Sure. Okay. But they used the attack on Pearl Harbor, which we now know they had full knowledge of. In fact, they not only did they provoke it, they knew it was coming, and they wanted it to happen because that was how they got into the war. But they was using an excuse for the Central Intelligence Agency. Fast forward to the future, the excuse for the Department of Homeland Security and it was a director. What's the new office now? Director of Intelligence that they created.
I don't know on that
Yeah,
one.
so they created a new office of who's sort of like the intelligence czar to coordinate and conduct all the information, because you all know 9/11 occurred because there was a failure of imagination to connect the dots. So it's the same thing over again. It's lies told, and these events are set up or staged to justify further consolidation of power. It's but it's nothing. That's nothing new under the sun, though. So
Right. I always learn new things when I'm on your show. Typically, the last time I learned about why Suburbia was created, and I didn't actually know that the CIA was justified on the basis of Pearl Harbor, but I do have an article on Pearl Harbor on my website called Pearl Harbor Roosevelt's 9/11. I actually
yeah,
wrote my first article on Pearl Harbor as a cover story for the New American in 1986, and I wrote another one in 2001. Uh, they wanted me to write it at that time because more information had come out with Robert Stinnett's book, Day of Deceit, plus they had the Ben Affleck movie on Pearl Harbor, and that was before 9/11 had occurred. So I've written two cover stories for them on Pearl Harbor, but I have a very updated one there. Um, of course, we knew about Pearl Harbor through, he had all the intelligence he needed. He knew through many personal warnings, as well as decoded naval intercepts and
hmm
decoded diplomatic intercepts. When I say he, I'm referring to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had full foreknowledge of the attack. All of that was suppressed. So the justification for the CIA, if that was it, completely false, completely phony, and obviously done for other purposes because everybody around Roosevelt knew full well that he had foreknowledge of that attack.
and that was not the one. That wasn't the finding of, but the wartime finding, the court martial
Well,
of General Short and Admiral. What was his name again?
Admiral Husband Kimmel.
Kimmel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what happened in that? I'll try to paraphrase it. Uh, a a rigged commission called the Roberts Commission, consisting of cronies of Roosevelt and the Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who we earlier mentioned in connection to the Marshall Plan, found Kimmel and Short guilty of dereliction of duty. When Kimmel and Short learned from their Navy buddies and Army buddies that Washington had these decoded intercepts warning of the attack, they wanted to be court-martialed, and so it could be the matter could be settled in a real courtroom. And Roosevelt forbade court-martials, saying it would endanger national security in wartime, blah, blah, blah. Well, eventually Congress demanded there be trials held, and the Naval Court of Inquiry and Army Pearl Harbor Board convened in 1944. They both exonerated those officers and found Washington completely guilty. And the Army Pearl Harbor Board actually concluded by saying that Washington knew everything that Japan was planning to do up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941. I almost gave you an exact quote there. But all of those findings were suppressed by Roosevelt in the interest of national security. He then had new investigations conducted in which Army and Navy officers were browbeaten into changing their testimony, all except for a couple brave ones who stuck to their guns, like Captain Lawrence Safford, who was the father of Navy cryptography. And so the findings were overturned. And interestingly enough, the man who overturned the Army Pearl Harbor Board's findings was a major. Oh, his name is going to escape me right now, but he was later appointed the head of all Freemasonry in America. So, I'm sorry, his name was Henry Clausen, Major Henry Clausen, later Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clausen, became he had the same position, I forget the name, it's a long title, same position that Albert Pike had, but he certainly got his reward
Mm-hmm.
for overturning that finding on Pearl Harbor. But the truth about that is known in books like Day of Deceit, which I mentioned by Robert Stinnett. My personal favorite is Infamy by John Toland, who was a Pulitzer Prize winner and fell out of favor because he started to tell the truth about history when he dug deep into the archives.
Yeah, that was like 81 or 82 when that book came out, Day of Deceit.
80 Day of Deceit was 2000, and Toland's book was I believe 83.
That was Deceit at Dawn, right?
Um, it was called Infamy
Infamy.
and
Okay,
Day
that's
of
right.
Deceit. There's another one, which is At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prang, but Gordon Prang is very much a government apologist. He worked for the government, and his whole objective was to try to discredit the truth movement on Pearl Harbor.
Was he the one that helped produce Tora Tora Tora?
Yes, he had a big hand in that movie, which makes it look like it was a. I did a show with Corbin on that
Yeah.
movie, and the movie tries to make it sound like it was a long series of accidents, slip ups, and happenstances that led to it. Kind of similar to 9/11 when we just goofed up and we just didn't pay attention to the reports and there were exercises going on and nobody noticed and the planes didn't get out, the fighter jets didn't get off in time to intercept the airliners before they struck, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I almost laugh when I watch that movie now. You're like Frank Knox driving around Washington trying to figure out what's going on, and George Marshall's riding his horse or something.
Oh my goodness, that was one of the longest horseback rides in history. They were trying to reach him so they could get his authorization to call Pearl Harbor, and he took this 3 hour horseback ride. It was actually at the airport meeting the Soviet ambassador. I was giving the good news that we're about to become a Soviet Union's ally in the war. And then when he finally showed up at his office, he refused to call Pearl Harbor. All he had to do was pick up the phone, and many lives would have been saved. But he insisted on sending a telegram, which went by Western Union and arrived several hours after the attack. That was he sent the warning to make himself look good, but he made sure it did not get there in time. These are facts that you can read about in these books I've mentioned, but also in my article on my website, 9/11 Roosevelt's. I'm sorry. Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 911.
Yeah, they have in Tora Tora Tora. They have the cable showing up, and you're supposed to be supposed to be like sort of like an ironic moment or something. But yeah, he could have picked up the phone and there's a direct line. He says, I think I'll send it Pony Express or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, he'd known about the attack for a long time, but he had to hold off. And actually, Roosevelt sent a plea to Hirohito for peace. He sent it on the evening of December the 6th, as he was composing his Day of Infamy speech, so he could say to the world, "Oh, I made a last-minute plea for peace, but alas, I was too late." Same thing with Marshall. They wanted to look good, but both of them knew were deeply involved with this. By the way, Marshall also a high-ranking Freemason.
Well, this is after Prince Kanoya, the Japanese prime minister, had proposed coming all the way to America to meet Roosevelt to settle things, avoid war. And I guess that would have been the summer of '41, and that refusal led to Prince Kanoya's resignation and the ascension of Tojo as prime minister. And they knew exactly, obviously Roosevelt knew by doing that he could provoke that response in Japan and give more power to the war party in Japan, so the attack would occur. He could corner Japan into attacking. So yeah, it was a complete setup.
Yeah, everything from the placing of the fleet in Pearl Harbor against all naval advice to the embargo on Japan, which was strangling it economically.
Yeah.
Which finally they had no recourse but to go to war because either it was starve or obey America's demand to pull all troops inside of Japan, which would have meant communism sweeping the Asian continent, which is what the statements had forewarned of, and which is exactly what happened as soon as the war was over.
Well, that's very interesting because well, one thing is the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies was necessitated, or at least brought on by the embargo, and they knew that would happen. And I still don't know why U.S. farm boys should die for the sake of European colonies in Asia. But that's a whole other issue. It's like we're doing Japanese aggression in Asia. Yeah, it's in Asia. That's the operative point there. It's in Asia. It's not against the United States. But of course, the U.S. interest in Asia. The irony is that Japan, for several decades, was the American empire's cat's paw. And then when Japan got really too big for its britches and started to be somewhat independent, it needed to be knocked down and declawed. And that's pretty much what you got in the Pacific War. But you had the intrigues with George Marshall and the loss of China to Mao. All that involves some of the diplomatic missteps, supposedly, with Stalin. Want to go into that? And what does that reveal about what was really going on with U.S. foreign policy at that time?
Well, of course, the objective of the Rothschilds had been the establishment of a world government under Zionist control, and communism, which was funded out of the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, was funded by the Warburgs and the Schiffs and the Rothschilds. They were trying to. You mentioned that Japan was one of our cat's paws. Actually, the Rothschilds supported Japan in the 1904-1905 war against Russia because Russia was then under the control of the Tsar, and they wanted to deal him a blow. But as communism expanded and it started to move into Asia,
was Jacob Schiff an agent of the Rothschilds?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, he was the head of Kuhn Loeb, and his partner at Kuhn Loeb was Paul Warburg, who was the first vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board.
Okay, so here we have Paul Warburg. Okay, he's instrumental in sending Trotsky back to Russia.
Schiff was anyway. Schiff gave Trotsky $20 million in gold, and
but his firm. The Warburg, okay. And so who sent Lenin back to Russia?
That was Paul Warburg's brother, Max Warburg, convinced the German government to send Lenin with gold on a train into Russia. So you had Lenin and Trotsky both being sent in from the outside with outside funds to overthrow the Tsar.
Now, this is interesting because the way it's understood in the conventional rendering of that history is that Germany is sending Lenin back to Russia to destabilize it so they can win the war in the East.
That's what they wanted.
Okay,
yes.
From the standpoint of the Central Powers, you can say, okay, there's some logic to that.
There was.
But why would the Allied powers send Trotsky back to Russia to destabilize Russia?
Well, this is what they ran into when Trotsky landed in Nova Scotia. When I say landed with his ship, he was arrested by the Canadian authorities because the Canadians knew that Trotsky intended to foment a revolution which would take Russia out of the war and would mean more Canadian soldiers would be killed on the Western Front. However, at the behest of Schiff and the banksters, Woodrow Wilson intervened and pressured the Canadian government into releasing him. It was not in the West's interest to have the Bolshevik Revolution take place because it did mean that more Americans, British, and Canadians would get killed. The banksters didn't care. They wanted that revolution to take place in 1917. 1917. Yeah, okay.
What this suggests is, at a meta level, the strategic objectives of the First World War, the Allied powers, are secondary. There's something going on at a meta level here, meaning that the elite are pulling the strings. They're setting things up that make very little sense, or it's hard to reconcile with what the people are being told what the First World War is being fought for. Correct?
I can give you half a dozen reasons for the First World War. Number one, to create world government. That's your League of Nations. Number two, to foment the Bolshevik Revolution, which is your first step towards world totalitarianism. Number three, to create the Balfour Declaration. Note that the Balfour Declaration, Bolshevik Revolution, and American Declaration of War all come in 1917. The Balfour Declaration, of course, is where Britain promised to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine in exchange for the Zionists bringing Woodrow Wilson and the Americans into the war. So that's your first, that's a blow in the favor of Zionism, to the first step towards the creation of the state of Israel. But other purposes of the war included profiteering. Bernard Baruch and his friends made $6 billion in money stolen from the American people for war munitions that were never manufactured or delivered to the front All of that came out in the Graham Committee of Congress post-war, but all the indictments were quashed, of course. The war also generated the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918, under which hundreds of Americans were prosecuted, but not one German spy. Anybody who dissented with the war, even with disagreeing with the idea of profiteering from the war, was prosecuted, and some were sent to jail for as much as 20 years. So there was a tremendous suppression of civil liberties, very similar to what we saw after 9/11. This is all happening 100 years ago, we're talking about. And those are some of the reasons, the true reasons for the First World War. A very multi-dimensional war, but most of them are. If you look at the Middle East now, yeah, part of it's about oil, part of it's about profit and debt, but a big part of it is about creating greater Israel.
But behind, if you look, people like Lenin and Trotsky, behind every revolutionary, there's a banker paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
And even with Marx had his Engels, right?
Engels was extremely wealthy, which you would not expect. You're supposed to think that these guys are, street level poor revolutionaries who are working on behalf of the proletariat.
Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately this goes back to of course, the strategy of Freemasonry.
Freemasonry is heavily involved with this. In fact, Lenin and Trotsky were both Freemasons.
I know what's funny about this. Again, we got the whole Cold War thing. Is at one level, a good example is the after World. Let's jump ahead to after World War II, and we have the early Cold War period, and of course Nixon's making his cutting his political teeth on the Hiss case, Alger Hiss.
Right.
And Alger Hiss is exposed as a communist spy, though he probably wasn't active at the time anymore. But what it looks to me is that after war, there was two different factions in the United States. There was roughly, you could say, maybe the pro-Nazi side, which is kind of the Dulles wing, and the pro-Russian side, which is the Hiss wing. And there was a conflict between the two, and that's why Hiss was ultimately exposed. It wasn't because he was a communist spy; it's because he was, at that time, the Dulles faction was in the process of winning out, getting control of this fledgling national security state. And although they were part of the same globalist project, you're different factions, kind of fighting it out, and which is why ultimately Hiss took the fall for that. Because he was getting, remember this goes back to kind of like the Morgenthau plan to destroy Germany, and how that was rejected because the people in the United States realized they needed a strong West Germany, supposedly to hold back the red tide. But the original plan was to destroy Germany economically.
There was definitely a Zionist plan of vengeance against Germany that even preceded the war itself.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if it was off the air or on there, or we talked about the fact that there had been a plan for war with Germany going back to Milner in 1900.
Oh, yeah. That goes back to British strategy.
Yeah.
Well, you could look at the whole destabilization of Germany. Germany thought it needed to destabilize. I'm sorry, Great Britain felt it needed to destabilize Germany because it was too strong on the continent. And the broad look at it, the broad perspective is that the rise of Hitler itself was seen as sort of a strategy that went awry, and they didn't foresee maybe France collapsing, and all of a sudden there's Germany driving deep into Russia, and that's when you see FDR really stepping up his efforts to provoke war with Japan. So it's an example where these things are being manipulated, but they're not always controlled. They can't control events perfectly. Yeah.
I would say that you're absolutely spot on there. When the Germans and their allies invaded Russia, Operation Barbarossa, June the 22nd, 1941, I stress allies because of the common perception today is this was simply a German plan of conquest. Well, Operation Barbarossa wasn't just the German army, it was the army of Finland, Italy, Romania, Croatia, and Hungary, as well as 47,000 Spanish volunteers that joined during the course of the war, and 2 divisions of Belgian soldiers, which comes as a real shock to people, a Flemish-speaking Belgian unit and a French-speaking one. And their goal was to destroy Bolshevism, which was the brainchild and uh, the sacred creation of the Zionist banksters. And it was about July the 1st, 1941, when well, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact date, but it was about a month after that invasion when the reports started coming in that Stalin's troops were collapsing. Because, to tell you the truth, the Russian troops didn't care that much about Stalin, and they weren't that sorry if he went. And it was when the reports started coming in. That is when you will find historically when Roosevelt instituted his oil embargo on Japan. The idea being to make sure that Japan, which had signed the anti-Comintern Pact, the anti-communist pact with Italy and Germany, made sure that they didn't invade from the east, because if they did, Stalin would have been caught in a vise, and Bolshevism, which they had created, the banksters had created, would have been destroyed. That's what made Pearl Harbor necessary. Mm-hmm. That's why the embargo. That's why all the provocations toward Japan, to make sure that they struck as you mentioned, the Dutch East Indies to the south instead of hitting Russia to their east. To the west, excuse me.
Yeah, you can see that. And what's going on there is, again, if you look at the research of Anthony Sutton and why Wall Street was funding the Bolsheviks, they also funded Hitler, but it might have been another motivation there. Is his idea was his idea of captured markets. And I think he's looking to set as a business plan, as he's not really getting into this, maybe the esoteric or philosophical or even spiritual dimension of this, but he's dealing with the fact that if you can destabilize Russia, all those resources that are in Russia are locked up for a while, or you can get at them cheaply, because that's what the Harrimans did, and that's what the Rockefellers did, and all that. They got all the, in return for all the factories that they built, they got a lot of these resources. That's how they got paid. That's why Ford and plants were being built in Russia. They were being paid with resources. But the idea there, according to Anthony Sutton, was to keep Russia weak. Again, Russia itself, much like Germany, was coming on strong in the early 20th century and needed to be destabilized. Of course, the Zionist, the Jewish angle is, of course, they had a vendetta against Russia because of the Pale settlement and how they were treated in Russia. So there was a hatred of the Russian of the Tsarist regime in Russia, because it was still one of the first ones that actually still was identified itself as a Christian crown, a throne, and that's why you had so much antipathy towards the Russian Tsar on Wall Street. So you have a lot of these factors. You have that, and of course you have the long-term British objective with the Mackinder Doctrine, where you have to weaken the continental powers in order to maintain the dominance, of the seas and their empire. The point is because the wars that were fought had nothing to do with what the public was told, or why their sons were being murdered in hundreds of thousands. So.
Yes, and hasn't that been the truth throughout history? It's pretty hard to find a war we've been involved with where the true purpose of the war was what the public was told. Whether you're talking about the American Revolution or the Civil War or the Spanish-American, the invasion of Veracruz, World War I, World War II, Korea, which is all about validating the UN, to go through Vietnam and all the Middle Eastern wars. We've never really been told the truth. It's always been for an alternative objective. And the controlled media, which we talked about early in the program, has always carried the misinformation to the public. That's why it's so important for people to tune into shows like yours and to start discerningly listening and reading alternative media instead of the controlled by 6 giant corporations mainstream.
Because it is all controlled. It's all controlled by the same parties. It's controlled by outfits like the CFR. Of course, we also have outfits like the Trilaterals Commission, which is sort of a spinoff of the CFR, or a continuation of that theme. I guess applied to the era of the 70s when it tried to do a deal that anticipated the CFR is more of an American European thing, where the Trilaterals were created to involve at the time with Asia, developing Asia, against Japan and
Yeah, it was
uh,
the three legs of
yeah.
Europe, Asia, and America, and it was actually a creation of Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, and Rockefeller was chairman of the CFR at that time. But like the Bilderbergs, it was one of those ways of interconnecting these agents of government power and industrialists across the world for that goal of consolidation that we talked about earlier. Like Bilderberg, like Bohemian Grove, it's
Mhm.
one more means of networking between the powers that be to bring to fruition their ultimate goal of a world government.
And trilateralism itself, a good example of their influence was, just 4 years after being created. I think it had maybe close to 90 American members, and a close to a third of those 90 members would infest the Carter administration.
Right. According to Zbigniew Brzezinski in his memoirs, every key policymaker in the Carter administration was a member of the Trilateral Commission. But interestingly, Jimmy Carter in his memoirs never mentioned the Trilateral Commission by name once.
Although he was a member, right?
He was a member, yes.
Yeah, he was one of the founding members, and he
That's
was
right.
and he was picked. I guess it was that meeting at the David Rockefeller's Tarrytown estate or something, where he
Hmm.
was, and then all of a sudden the media. Just a good example of how the media is controlled, because all of a sudden Jimmy Carter became the candidate, right?
That's right. 9 months before the convention, less than 4% of all registered Democrats favored Jimmy Carter for president. So what happens is he's on the cover of Time three times, and Times cover artists are told to make him look like John F. Kennedy. And he's on the cover of Newsweek twice. And the Wall Street Journal has an editorial saying he's the best candidate of all the Democrats. And the New York Times runs a series of puff pieces on him. And so he gets the nomination. And like I always say, Tim, you and I could become president and vice president if the powers that be chose to. They could bring us out of nowhere and
Yeah.
get us elected, and then people would think there's nothing really strange about it.
Oh, it's almost like, yeah, like the show Being There, right? That movie Being There.
Well, yeah, uh,
It was
yeah.
just,
That's
of course, there it was created spontaneously, but it was funny how because he came out of nowhere because he was hiding in that estate his entire life, so no one knew who he was. So,
there seems to be a subliminal meaning to that film. I saw it in the '70s when I was politically uninformed, or was it the '70s or was it early '80s? Peter Sellers in that role,
yeah.
but I do remember that there was a scene with a giant Masonic pyramid in it.
Hmm.
And he was mingling with all these wealthy power brokers. And I have to think that there was some kind of significance to that film, some sort of subliminal message, but I'm not sure what it was. I'd have to revisit that. But it was an interesting little bit of film history, very late in Peter Sellers' career, as I
Yeah.
recall.
The end when he's walking on water or something at the funeral, and all the guys at the funeral are saying, "I think he's our guy." Yes, I think he's our guy.
Hmm.
He speaks in these broad
Yeah.
generalities, these phrases he hears on television. He just repeats, and yeah,
Yeah, well, very little in Hollywood, like politics, happens by accident. So I'm sure there was something beyond entertainment to that film.
yeah, I know, yeah. So, but it was funny because Carter himself, although he was a trilateralist, he was picked. He was kind of because, of course, what we know about Watergate was it was more. It wasn't just the second-rate burglary, and nor was it these crusading journalists or Woodward and Bernstein that took out Nixon. Nixon appeared to be a victim of some sort of intel black ops, and of course Woodward himself came from naval intelligence, and many of the principal figures of the Watergate scandal had direct ties to intelligence. So it appeared to be a coup to unseat Nixon, um, and so considering that environment. Carter was picked, and but he seemed to rebel a little bit because I do remember the Halloween massacre at CIA, and that's when Bush and Ted Shackley and they all started the Safari Club, this private intelligence network, uh, and that involved funding of the beginning of the Afghan operation and all these all these illegal arms sales. And so Carter seemed to be somewhat of a reformer who was taken out. That's, of course, that goes back to the intrigues involved surrounding the Iranian hostage crisis, where some people think that was orchestrated to weaken Carter. at the very least, it appears to be the crisis was lengthened to weaken Carter. With the October surprise thing. So for some reason or other, they they didn't like Carter, so he was taken out. So
Maybe he seemed to serve them well in a number of ways. In fact, he was. If you go to my website, I have a article there goes back some years to the New American called "Iran and the Shah: What Really Happened." And Carter certainly played a very significant role in undermining the Shah,
mm-hmm.
and that actually traces to Henry Kissinger. There's a big link up, as we've already talked about, between Democrat and Republican. And, Jimmy Carter de-recognized Free China. He broke our relations with Free China, even
mm-hmm.
though the Congress had voted unanimously that he should first consult that body, waited for Christmas. But you can very easily see that what Kissinger did in taking Nixon to China was paving the path for the diplomatic changes that Carter made. In the same way, Henry Kissinger was the one who initiated the plan to destabilize and overthrow the Shah, because he was going to nationalize, much as his predecessor Mossadegh had done and tried to do in the 50s, going to try and nationalize oil in Iran. And that set the plan in motion, and Carter began screaming about human rights abuses by the Shah, which had not been a subject of media discussion before. And he was very instrumental in that, and it seemed like he was carrying out their orders pretty well. But I wasn't really familiar with that CIA Halloween event you mentioned. So there certainly may have been things going on that I was not aware of that caused conflict. Certainly,
well,
he had.
He fired George Bush.
Okay.
Yeah, and then brought in Stansfield Turner, his naval buddy, who actually was new to intelligence. Was George Bush was supposed to be an intelligence person?
All right.
And so these guys don't go quietly into the night. And Ted Shackley, who had eyes on the directorship, was kicked out. But these guys had all these intelligence networks established, through the various black op dealings. So they established, the story was, in the post-Church committee hearings in the late 70s, the CIA was defanged and Congress wasn't happy to fund anything. So they had to find alternative ways to fund their various operations and black ops.
Makes sense.
They established the Safari Club, which was a private intelligence fund. It was funded by Saudis, Iran, the Gulf states, South Africa, to keep these operations going in the meantime, before they got Carter out. And eventually they got Carter out. There is some evidence to suggest that the hostage crisis itself was precipitated, and what really happened was I think it was Kissinger who told Carter to accept the Shah into the country to get treated for cancer, knowing full well that this would cause an embassy to be overrun and create the hostage crisis. And the hostage crisis created the pretext for the U.S. government to seize Iranian assets, and these were funds that were in Chase Manhattan Bank. And Chase Manhattan Bank was over the water. It was apparently in some financial trouble, and the seizing of the assets kept the money in the Chase Manhattan Bank.
Well, now that's a piece of history that was a blank page for me. Thank you for filling that in.
Now that's speculative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking. You're looking at who benefit. I'm doing a who benefits analysis here,
mm-hmm.
And so that's it's not. They're not beyond doing that. Nor are they beyond the idea of Bush and Casey meeting with the Iranians, told them to keep the hostages held until the inauguration day, until after Reagan is elected, and that's another angle to this. And
I remember that well when as soon as Reagan was in, the hostages were freed.
Yeah, and there was, of course, at the time it was played up because Reagan was tough and blah blah
mm-hmm.
blah. No, but really looking back at it, it's fairly obvious. Plus the fact that neither Bush nor Casey can account for their whereabouts on those days. So, and you've witnesses that they did fly there. And what an interesting side story of that is one of the witnesses was an arms trader pilot who claimed that he did fly Bush to Paris that day when Bush said he wasn't there, and there's some evidence that said actually they came out and they had a credit card receipt from that pilot in Seattle, Washington, on the very day he said he flew to Paris. The only problem is they found out that the credit card receipt was fraudulent.
So
So
what does that mean?
it means that someone's trying to debunk this witness, and they have what they did is they created a fake credit card. They had the ability to make a fake credit card receipt,
Hmm.
with the stamping, with the date and the restaurant and all that. But they got there was no the waitress. They got the name of the waitress wrong or something. It was like there's no waitress by that name working there. So it was a bad. It was a. It looks like a very sophisticated way to
Hmm.
frame the witness as a perjurious witness.
Right, and sounds like something that the CIA,
Yeah,
that type of
exactly.
thing, they would specialize in.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, the idea, giving all the things that the intelligence agencies do and the powers that be do, the idea of making the hostages stay there, cool their heels for another 60, 90 days isn't, to me, in the history of things, isn't that outlandish. So to me, it's not hard to believe at all, considering some of the things they do. Sending 60,000 Americans to die in Vietnam for no good reason and get
Hmm.
a couple million Vietnamese killed in the process so they can sell helicopters and bring in their opium, or bring in their heroin. So that's really, from the whole scheme of things, it's really not not that bad.
Well, let me ask you this. I know that we've covered a lot of topics
Yeah.
tonight, but just curious now. You said that the plan was to use the hostages as an excuse to seize Iranian assets. Now, when they released the hostages, did the Iranians get the assets back?
Only partially. No, even now, that's well, they got the. Well, there you go. Right. They did not get all. In fact, they only got partial. If I recall, only got a portion of it back, and to this day, assets are still being held.
Huh.
But there's no honor among thieves, is there? So
There's always a financial subtext to all of these things. Some people think it's all about money, but of course you've heard all the stories about financial shenanigans on 9/11, from
yeah,
short selling to gold bars being driven out of trucks that morning
yeah.
before the buildings collapsed.
Well, there's always a financial element, but that's not the only element.
Right.
There's
That's why we say that multidimensional.
It's multidimensional, and I think ultimately it's like for these people, it's not so much about money; it is about control and power because they make the money. So you know, and which ultimately I think goes back to the temptation in the desert when the when Jesus is shown the kingdoms throughout the world. And so I will give you power, dominion over these things. All you have to do is bow at my feet, and Jesus refuses. And I think as you wrote in your latest book, other parties haven't been so haven't been so, I guess, opposed to bowing at his feet. So
Right. Jesus did not accept the kingdoms, but he
yeah,
didn't deny that Satan could make good on that promise to give them to him. And
yeah,
it appears that, indeed, if you look at the works of Ted Gunderson, former high-ranking FBI official, or John Coleman, former MI6 officer, or William Guy Carr, who was a Canadian intelligence, they all said the power elite are actually Satanists and worshippers of Satan. And the idea that Satan would give power to these same people, uh, even though we don't see what happens at the very highest level of interaction, I do believe that something very dark and just darkly spiritual is being carried out, that we see executed at our level in the wars and
hmm
the global transitions that negative transitions that take place.
yeah. It's hard to when you look at some of the things that are done in the name of empire, all the death and destruction and the human suffering that's created by these policies. It's hard to come to some other conclusion. That they've sold their soul. So
Right. Jesus said you should know them by their fruits, and their fruits have been consistently bad for the economy, for our health. When I'm talking about vaccines, GMOs, chemtrails, processed foods, and so forth, the deaths in wars, the debt created by the Federal Reserve, everything these guys do is bad. So they're certainly not just clumsy and stupid. They're definitely evil, and we're seeing that evil played out on the American people, who need to wake out of their slumber and their sleep and stop watching Fox and CNN, and, as we said, turn into alternative media and start to really put it together and figure it out and understand not only where these bad guys fit in, but where we fit into the grand scheme of the universe.
hmm definitely, and by all means, read. Spend more time reading. It's more of a intellectual exercise. Your brain gets
Mm-hmm.
better. You become a better thinker, and you can break away from the flicker rate of the TV screen, or so it helps your brain function.
Oh, well, Tim, I'd much rather watch a few hours of soap opera than crack open a book.
And have to think. I don't want to spend a whole day thinking it. Spend a whole day working. I don't have to come home and have to think, and that's because that's another scam they have on us too. Keep us doing that rat race on the. So you're so exhausted and tired. All you want to do is veg out, watching, eating junk food and watching TV. So.
Well, that's the plan. Have everybody work two jobs because of debt and inflation, and then you're so exhausted you get home and you turn on the boob tube and there's nothing but that pre-programmed entertainment, which is designed to keep you misinformed and ill-informed and distracted while they complete their plans for world domination. So you're exactly right. That is exactly it. Uh, Eat, TV, work, sleep, get up, work, more TV, etc. Cycle. Yeah.
Well, James, I want to thank you for coming on, spending so much time with me tonight.
Well, I want to thank you for hosting me. You've had some fabulous guests. I was talking about this with you off air, but I looked at your recent lineup of shows. The last one was Corbett on the Manchurian Candidate. You seem to have some really fascinating guests and topics, and I'd love to just take a day. And it wouldn't be mindless entertainment either. It'd be entertaining, but it would be far from mindless, and just listen to a bunch of these shows that you've done, because you've had some terrific guests and topics recently.
Well,
So
thank you.
well done on putting together a lot of pieces of the puzzle that people need to know about.
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff is food for thought. I am by no means an expert, nor do I have all the answers, nor do I completely understand these things. Like everyone else, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on in this crazy world. And so, as the evidence, as I gather evidence, and I draw the inferences, and and have my views of these things, but they do change as I see the evidence. So it's one of those things where we talk about these various events. None of us have the power of subpoena to go in and get these documents and put them in court.
Well, we wish.
So we're stuck. We're groping in the dark and trying to figure out what we're touching, and so we are at a distinct disadvantage. But again, it's when I'm rambling now, but again, I'm just one person here. You're just one person here, or who tries to look at the evidence and do the research and try to figure out what's going on in this world. Because one thing we're all saying is we have not been told the truth.
That's right, and we've actually made fantastic progress in that quest for truth. So much has been uncovered, and thanks to the internet, things that used to be only known in dusty hardbacks that were long forgotten on bookshelves have now found their ways onto search engines, and we can instantly access information that before we would have had to travel across the country to get to a research library to find. So information is available, and great progress is made. I'm thankful to God that we've been able to do it and to overcome so many of the lies and deceit. There's still many things, and like you, Tim, I'm constantly learning. Like I say, I learn new things every time I'm on your show from you, probably things that you either picked up from your individual research or from the many interesting guests that you have on.
Definitely,
we're constantly learning, but I feel that confident that it's clear that we're on the correct path. We're simply peeling off the layer of lies that have been shoved off on us by the mass media. One by one, they're coming off, and as each lie comes off, the whole picture becomes clearer. I'm glad of this.
That's so true. I mean, I just remember just a few years ago, the idea of trying to understand Freemasonry seemed to be like, what? That's weird stuff. That's crazy. And you were, but again, it's amazing just how central Freemasonry is to the modern world. In fact, I was reading a book the other day about another topic, but there was a paragraph in there that said the modern world is Masonic.
I believe that as a fair description. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole world has become Masonic, and I thought that was a great way to put it, because how we view the world, how we're told to view the world. If you understand Freemasonry, their image of the world, it is that we see the world in its image, and that's the truly revolutionary power of Freemasonry, which I think goes back to Illuminism, which ultimately goes back to the temptation in the garden, which is what we're dealing with here, I think. So there you go. Oh, well, listen, James, thanks again, and we'll talk again soon. Take care, and good night.
Good night, Tim. Thank you, and hope that your listeners also learned something tonight. And look forward to continuing this adventure in the search for truth with you.
Well, you're most certainly welcome. Good night.